Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse. In this episode, Cameron guides us in a discussion or how we would respond to somebody who says, well, what's the big deal with sin? So we think about definitions of sin, the way we want to think about it biblically, the influence and the impact that it has culturally, and try to put some handles on how we want to think about the question and how we might help other people think about it as well. Thinking Out Loud is a ministry where we travel, speak, teach, preach, podcast, all sorts of different things. And if you enjoy us being loose in the world doing those activities, you can support us or like, share, comment, whatever at toltogether.com.
In the words of Christian rock musician, Steve Taylor, whom many of you will probably not remember, whatever happened to sin? If you knew that, then you might have grown up in an evangelical household. If you know that song, you might have, if you want to look it up, you know what, I can't stop you. But on a serious note, Nathan, I am finding more and more that not only is the doctrine of sin unfashionable, it's seen as something that's very harmful, especially by a lot of younger people. They'll say, why would some of the ways in which this is phrased would be, what makes you think we need to be saved in the first place? And then if it goes further, it will be, well, isn't that a horrible way to look at human beings as, as fallen? I mean, what a kind of, just, that's a terrible way to see the human race in the first place. That certainly seems to be a very harmful view. So this is important for a number of different reasons. One way I put it recently was, if you're a person who cares about speaking with non-believers or those who are on the fence or those who are skeptical, and you care about presenting evidence for Christianity, this changes the way that evidence is going to be seen. So for instance, you say there's very compelling historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Somebody might counter and say, "What? Why did Jesus have to die in the first place? So he could appease the wrath of God? And, so God had to kill his son just to make, himself feel better and save me?" So just to show you how this reframes some of these questions for people. Now, I'm not necessarily agreeing that this reframing is right. In fact, I often don't think it is. But I'm thinking, Nathan, how can we talk sensibly about sin in a way that makes this comprehensible and add some sense to it for people who are conditioned to see it as just totally bizarre or even harmful?
Well,
I thought that
that's
might be a helpful conversation.
yeah, let's lean into this a little bit. So I know you'd been running into this question online a good bit. I hadn't run into it until a week or two ago when I was speaking in Chicago on the topic of lust. Somebody had asked a question to one of our friends afterward of like, kind of, what is the big deal about this? And he was kind of, as we would, like, what do you mean? What's the big deal about sin? Like, the question itself, if you've grown up in a Christian framework, is almost hard to know where to get started on that conversation. But here's the thought that I had that maybe gives us some guidelines into going into this, is that there are times, if you're listening to this as a Christian, that it's really handy to have a concordance and to actually kind of do a quick word study where you can sort of look across quickly, um, kind of the range of the way in which it's used in Bibles. Usually a concordance will have that word and then a fragment of the sentence. And if you've been reading your Bible, you can kind of fill in the gaps of the stories. It'll kind of give you an idea of what's going on in this. So, for example, if you look up sin, and if you don't have a concordance or an online Bible software, you can, like, blueletterbible.com is one that I use frequently. It's pretty basic, but you just type in sin in the translation you want, and it'll spit out all the verses that have the word sin in it. If you look at that, the first several that pop up for, like, Genesis, where does sin first show up? Genesis 4 is when Abel or Cain has killed Abel, and then God says to him, "Sin is crouching, sin is lying, depending sin is crouching at your door," I think is a popular, and you must master it. Then you get the word sin in the fight between Jacob and Laban. You get sin in reference to the relationships in Sodom and Gomorrah. You get sin in relationship to the relationship between Joseph and his brothers in Israel, asking for the restoration of relationship there. And so, in every single case of sin being used in Genesis, it has to do with a fracturing of relationship. So it's relationships that are destroyed because somebody did something wrong.
Mhm.
Now, before we even push that even farther into the Exodus, Leviticus, and the rest of the Bible usage of it, it's specifically thinking in relation to our relationship with God, And you can push back in, even though the word sin isn't directly used in Adam and Eve's rebellion against God and the downfall and the separation that happens, the fracturing of that relationship, we can pretty quickly, just by looking at, kind of tips of the icebergs there, say that sin fundamentally has to do with the warping and the destruction and the relational upheaval that comes from somebody doing something that they shouldn't have. And I think if we can frame it in that relational damage category, then suddenly perhaps we can talk about it with a little more. Nobody would say, "Well, what's wrong with broken relationships or people that hate each other or murder or sexual abuse?" I don't think we're quite culturally ready to have that degree of flippancy toward
Mhm.
disorder just yet. So that would be my kind of answer to your question of how might we start leaning into this, is to say, well, if we want to look at the biblical description of it, it has to do fundamentally with the brokenness of relationship, and then go from there.
Yeah, and I think one of the if we take a responsible view of human life, it can be a disillusioning exercise. And I try to be careful with this because you don't want to run into territory where you look like too much of a hardened pessimist. But you can so for a certain sector of the educated world, evil is really equated what we would call evil is just equated with ignorance. So
Hmm.
the notion
Or
is,
inconvenience. Yeah.
yeah, inconvenience, but ignorance in the sense that if we have the proper education and people reach a sufficient form of enlightenment, then we'll see a lot of this harmful social behavior eradicated. It'll go away, and we can fight back against economic disparity, and crime will go down, and all of that. Now, I'm not going to say that. I mean, education, of course, can play a role in helping redress some of these issues, but the notion that it's going to solve them is, I would submit to you, naive because there's no necessary correlation between someone's education level and their behavior, their moral behavior. And there's no necessary
Oh,
correlation between, yeah, a high level of intelligence and moral behavior. We can very easily demonstrate that some of the most gifted and capable people are also some of the most immoral people as well. So we have to, and then here's another place. I'm grateful to Tim Keller for pointing me in the direction of this resource, but this was Jacob Needleman, who is a professor at San Francisco University, wrote a book called Why Can't We Be Good? And in that book, his thesis is the problem is not ignorance per se. We know what we need to do. We all know we ought to do unto others. But the problem is we can't do it.
hmm.
We can't seem to do it. We've never been able to do it. And I've heard people resist that, say, "Oh, that's not true." Well, really? It's
Question.
demonstrably true.
I want to throw a flag on your thing about like if you're well educated, you'll think evil is about because I it seems to me that the summation of the totality of history has been proving this point. I mean, even
Yeah.
like, how could you read Crime and Punishment?
Mhm.
How could you not read Crime and Punishment and say that you're well educated on the impact of like rationalizing sin in the outfold of like whether or not you can kill an old lady with an axe? Um, ah, to me, that's a
Spoiler alert, Nathan. Just kidding.
sorry. Um, you know what I'm saying? Like, what are we talking about when we're saying like what education are we referring to here? I guess it's a very narrow definition of education if you want to play that. Like I think
Well,
people generally have that same response to Pinker's that that angels of our better
mm,
nature or what
the
is it?
better angel of nature, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, the notion there is also, though, that if yeah, if you have more education, we tend to move away from violence. Yeah, and Steven Pinker has been on this kick for a while, but he's been roundly critiqued because it doesn't withstand scrutiny, and it doesn't withstand the evidence
We
that
would like
continues
it to
to
be
this day.
true.
Of course. And this is why I want to, yeah, I don't want to sound triumphalistic when I make these arguments.
That'd be great.
These are sad facts of human life. So we have to sin is very crucial in a number of different ways. It's crucial for a proper anthropology, for understanding how human beings work in the first place. If we if we don't take this one into account, it can be very dangerous. Utopian visions of human flourishing are predicated on the notion that human beings are perfectible. and that human nature is essentially some sort of a blank slate, and it's really the society that corrupts. That
Well,
is a
that's
line of
still
thinking.
alive and well political theory also.
Absolutely. And it goes, I mean, it goes all the way back to Rousseau, but it's exceedingly dangerous because, well, it's always dangerous to underestimate the destructive capacities of a person. It's also dangerous because if you have some sort of perfectibility project going on, history is replete with horrendous examples of what happens. I mean, basically, ends justify the means. This is where you get a lot of revolutionary language, and a lot of this, of course, was first sort of we saw real vivid expression in Marxist lines of thinking and revolutions. But yes, as you said, Nathan, this continues with us to this day. It's essential to understanding who we are, but it's also essential in us recognizing that we have to be saved.
Well,
We can't take care of ourselves.
but I think that the fundamental thing that it's up against though is that to imply that there's such a thing as sin means that there's such a thing as oughtness. And we don't like
Yes.
that moral parameter that has some bearing. Because to the Christian, the question, what's the big deal about sin is kind of like, well, what's the big deal about sticking your hand under a running lawnmower?
Mhm.
Obviously, in our minds, it leads to bloodshed, death, and destruction, and gruesome, gory suffering that wouldn't need to be there. Um, but if that is the paradigm of the world that you have, that that is what's normal, and you haven't seen an alternative to that, then sin doesn't really. Actually, there was a girl from. This is interesting. I had when I lived in England, I had 2 neighbors who were, from mainland China, hadn't been anywhere else, just straight from mainland China to Oxford, and we were talking a lot about religion and spirituality and the whole at one point after a couple weeks, one of the girls said, she said, "It's very interesting." She said, "I think sin is like freedom, in that for the last 25 years of my life, I had no concept of what the idea of freedom was until I moved out of the context in which I grew up, and now I recognize and understand what freedom is." She
Mm.
said, "I think sin is like that too." That and I was like, "Actually, that's a very profound way of thinking about it. If you think what I have is the way that it has to be and is normal, and I don't see an alternative to that, then you really don't think about the category itself." And so there might be a little bit of a sense, Cameron, in which we're um, just kind of get with a heavy sigh saying, like, yeah, well, this is just the brokenness of the world. Why do we have to have a system that makes us feel guilty about it? Because if you can't see an alternative to that, then what's the point in moralizing?
And getting out of that oughtness conundrum is not easy, though. I think this is the opening section of Mere Christianity is very helpful here, where C.S. Lewis talks about the sense of right and wrong as being a clue to the nature of reality itself. So even people who insist that, well, there's no such thing as objective morality. I've had several of these conversations lately, Nathan, when they'll start to say, yeah, but you don't need it. I mean, human empathy works really well. Well,
Read
why on earth would
cannibalism.
yeah, but why on earth would human empathy be in any way necessary? I mean, why would that be what how would we justify human empathy on the view that there's no intrinsic moral structure to the universe at all? Now, we might think, well, it's good to empathize, it's good to, care for the
It's
weak and the
it's
marginalized,
just
but
a
that's
warped
by
form of
no
self-preservation.
yeah, it's by no means self-evident. But the fact of the matter is, though, we all tend to lean back in our everyday pursuits and our everyday habits on basic understandings of right and wrong. So that's why C.S. Lewis looks at her some of the how would you like it if anybody did that to you? That wasn't fair. You need to wait your place in the line. So if you're waiting in a line, everybody in Britain knows queuing is kind of part of an essential part of British culture, and you have to learn how to queue, and you got to cooperate in the queue. And heaven help you if you try to skip ahead or try to violate the sacred protocol of the queue. But I mean, we're like, I mean, if somebody cuts it in front of us, or if somebody cheats us out of something, well, there's this deep sense of wrongdoing, and we respond immediately on a visceral level to it. Why? Well, because we have this deep inward recognition that there's a right way and a wrong way to do something. And cheating people out of something, trying to skip ahead, cheating the system, even though we tend to kind of take ourselves off the hook for some of this behavior. But that's why Lewis says
Hang
the
on.
overall
Yeah, give the Lewis quote, and I wanna push back a second.
yeah, because the overall assessment here is that there is indeed a way we ought to behave. There is a moral law, and 2, we do not keep that law. We recognize that we're transgressors. We recognize that we fall short. We recognize that we hold other people's to standards that we ourselves don't keep.
Balance that with, for me, with yeah, I jokingly I did read a book about cannibalism a couple years back. There are people who eat other people with no moral qualms about it, and in fact, do it often with veneration and ascribe a moral positive to it. So I'm stuck in between here, Cameron. With like, I think there are things that are like, oh, somebody passing me in line, I don't like it. Versus the fragmentation of moral boundaries, or like so if somebody passes me
Well
in line, I don't think something sacred is being violated. I think if somebody eats somebody else, something sacred is being violated. And at the same
well,
time,
no, hold on there.
yeah,
Hold on there.
clarify
So
that.
the cannibalism thing comes up quite a bit, and I don't think it works in quite the way that the critic thinks it does. So people sometimes will use this to show the how moral what we're taking as deep moral sentiments is in fact very culturally relevant, and it's a cultural construction. So certainly you do have places where that's practiced. And cannibalism in some settings it was seen as taking on the actual there's a spiritual dimension to it, taking on the strengths of one's opponents is a symbol of dominance, but it
Or
wasn't
honoring
just a
an
symbol.
ancestor.
Yeah, honoring as and now this wasn't just a symbol. This is a highly literal and very unfortunate thing to happen to you if you happen to be the victim. But the point is, it's not indiscriminate cannibalism across the entire tribe. Within that tribe, there are sacred moral standards that look actually an awful lot like ours. They have to do with that you're not in other words, you're not going to travel a globe and find a culture in which traitors are honored and cowardice is seen as a good thing. You're not going to find a place where there's a complete inversion of all moral values. You certainly will find different views of human nature and human anthropology, but even in places where cannibalism takes place or human sacrifice is taking place, there are still sacred systems in place. And also, when in the day to day affairs of that tribe, not every single human being in the tribe is being sacrificed. There are specific victims who are selected for very specific reasons for human sacrifice. Let's take the Aztecs, for example. And these are done to appease a particular deity.
So you
So,
wait, let me make sure I'm following your argument here, because you're not saying that the action you're saying that all cultures have a system of what is sacred, regardless of
no,
whether or not the action is right or wrong, or you're saying that even the Aztecs had a moral compass that they could tell when they were violating the laws of Yahweh?
I'm saying that you're not going to find no, I'm not making that ambitious of an argument. I'm
Okay.
making the argument that you're not going to find a culture where there's their values represent a total inversion of all of the basic ways in which we live.
Ah, come on, Cameron. You're a Presbyterian. Where's that total depravity?
Right. Yeah, but you're not gonna find I mean, you will find different practices that we regard to be heinous, child sacrifice among them. I mean, this is obviously a huge item in the Old Testament. This is singled out repeatedly as one of the most heinous practices of the tribes who Israel, confronting Israel. And then Israel, of course, falls into this sin as well. But I'm just saying you're not gonna find a place where there's a complete inversion of more of all of what we take to be normal values of living and ways of, a place where you're gonna find, a traitor is honored and cowardice is rewarded, that kind of thing. So those exotic examples can add some clarifying light to these conversations, but sometimes they detract from a larger point that there's still an overwhelming consensus, I would argue, on basic ways of living, basic
Okay,
modes of fairness, and it
so
applies everywhere. Yep, and
I got to
people
think about
experience
this,
it everywhere. Yeah.
because I'm trying to decide. I have two scriptures in my mind that. So you have Paul, Romans 1, people are without an excuse. Like, everybody should be able to know this. There's that
Mhm.
line of thinking. Flip side is, though, you look at a John 16 kind of thing, Jesus is praying, talking about the Holy Spirit coming and saying it's the role of the Spirit to convict people of sin. And so the conviction that something bad is happening is not embedded necessarily in culture or nature, but in the act of God highlighting to humanity, hey, you shouldn't do this. There's another way. That's the
Yeah, and I feel that tension there. So I think that's of course I believe that's true. I mean, this is why Stanley Hauerwas says recognizing that you're a sinner is a theological achievement. So I would agree
it's a
with
great
that
line.
readily.
Okay.
But I do also think we're made in the image of God. So that means we do have a conscience. Now, the perceptive listeners here are going to notice that what Lewis is getting at, though he doesn't name it, and what I'm getting at, though I haven't named it until now, is called natural law. It's natural law theory. And you have to take it with a grain of salt because there are those who are major proponents of natural law theory, and there are those who view it with more suspicion or think it's misguided. So C.S. Lewis is a big believer in natural law theory. He also draws on it quite heavily for his book, The Abolition of Man. That's the place where you probably get the most sophisticated treatment of that. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. But yeah. So I would say, here's what I'm comfortable saying. I'm comfortable saying every human being is made in the image of God and endowed with a conscience. And a conscience, I love John Lennox's way of putting it, is an outpost of God's government. Now, does that mean that everybody is receiving clear intelligence in that little outpost? Absolutely not. Is it possible to have a deadened conscience? Yes, it absolutely is. But I think but I'm also saying though, even within highly tyrannical systems, let's say an easy place to point here would be the Third Reich. Even within the Third Reich, there were still you still have conditions where courage was honored, where I mean, again, another way of looking at this is a basic Augustinian anthropology, which says that all evil is corrupted good, and I think that's right. So if you have a figure like a major Nazi commandant, or Hitler himself, imagine all of that charisma, all of that strength being turned toward a constructive end, toward a redemptive end. You could see tremendous good come from that. When it's turned toward selfish ends, it can be it can be lethal and so bad we can't even imagine it. So,
So is
yeah.
yeah, all right, let's take that and then to run it back around though, what's the big deal with sin? Is the permanence of it and the possibility for something other than to be the case. So
Hmm.
I think we're playing with two ways of thinking. One is like it is what it is, and then the Christian vision of it isn't what it ought to be. And here's the majestic vision of the alternative, and here's the actual purpose for the skill, gift, ability, resources, blessing, whatever you want to call it, that you have, that is a gift to you from God. So the big deal of sin is the thief has come to kill, steal, and destroy, and I have come that they might have abundant life. Those are two very different visions of what's possible, regardless of your starting point.
Yes, and I think one basic if we just zoom out from all of this, we've gone into some weeds here, is to I like Cornelius Plantinga's version,
I
way of
knew it was
looking at
coming.
this is yeah, as a comment, I mean, you gotta bring it up.
Talk about that
But
book because make a recommendation on that real quick before we pass it.
yeah, it's called Not How It's Supposed to Be. It's a very valuable
Breviary on
book.
sin.
Yeah, a breviary on sin, not how it's supposed to be, and I think his definition, if I'm remembering correctly, is that sin, he defines it as a willing vandalism of shalom.
Hmm.
So and it's quite, I mean, he's quite a poetic and vivid writer in many ways, but essentially we can look at the world and everybody, there seems to be and again, I'm big on common recognitions. I think those are important. That's what C.S. Lewis was big on too, because he was Mr. Philosopher of Common Sense. So these small little daily habits that function as clues into reality, into the nature of reality. So if you think that things ought to be fair, those who are disadvantaged ought to be taken care of and protected, you know, we need to recognize that there's something. Is there really something there? And C.S. Lewis would say yes. I would say yes. Christianity would say yes. But also, there seems to be a very common response to the world that says things are not right. Something has gone off. Now, there are wildly different responses to that. Some people do run into the direction of, no, human beings are perfectible. We can fix this. I think all of the evidence is against that line of reasoning because it simply doesn't work. It never has worked. And all we hear really on that is, well, we haven't gotten it right yet, but one day we will. Or there are those who have been saying for a long time, we actually need a savior. We have to be saved. We can't pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We can't save the world. We can't save the environment. We can't even save ourselves. We can barely get through our own lives without being dishonest. Dallas Willard once said, if you really want to trust Jesus, just stop lying entirely. In every sense of that word. Every sense of that word, you'll be thrown on the mercies of God. Don't stretch the truth. Don't exaggerate your strengths and gifts. Don't lie at all. And watch what happens. So we have to be saved. And coming to that recognition is yeah, I think is a very important part of understanding ourselves and the limits of
Yeah.
human nature.
Let me piggyback on that a second. So, just for those of you who are listening along, I found my copy on the shelf here, fact checking Cameron in real time. And the first chapter of Cornelius Planning is not the way it's supposed to be, is titled "The Vandalism of Shalom." But he gives a further definition here, and I want to read this to us, and then Cameron, because this will get into the blame and the guilt element of it that is seen to be bad. So he says, let us say that a sin is any act, any thought, desire, emotion, word, or deed, or in its particular absence, that displeases God and deserves blame. And so I think there are people who would be tangentially or adjacently okay with the idea of things not being the way they're supposed to be. I think when you add that deserves blame onto the back end of it, that he's right when he says sin is a religious concept and not just a moral one.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting distinction to make here. So, can you say a little bit about that? Why does adding blame and guilt language into sin change the calculus of the way that people are tend to respond to this?
Well, because it means that we're morally culpable, and that's where recognizing yourself as a sinner is indeed a theological achievement, and that's why we as Christians can be faithful messengers, but we can't be the Holy Spirit on this one. We don't convict of sin. And so that distinction is absolutely crucial there because we have to recognize if we're Christians, we're recognizing ourselves not just as deviating from a certain kind of baseline moral norm, that's common to all cultures. We're recognizing ourselves as transgressors of God's law.
Okay, okay.
So that's different. Yes.
But it
That's
also
way
means that
different.
we can't
Yeah.
fix it ourselves. And this
Correct.
is the
Well,
nature of the heart of the gospel, which is saying that
yes.
God will take on the punishment for the blame of the sin of humans
Yes.
who want it from him.
So not only so we deserve condemnation. And this is here are all the parts that are the hardest of sells. And this is why we're not selling anybody anything. We're just telling we're telling the truth and being faithful witnesses. We're deserving of God's God's wrath. And so we have to not only do we need to be saved, we have to be forgiven. And this is why Jesus said, I came to heal the sick, not the righteous. And those are actually quite chilling words because he's speaking to religious leaders who basically thought of themselves as righteous. And so heaven help us if we think that we're righteous and that we don't need to be saved and that we've got it all together. But if we recognize that we have indeed violated God's sacred command, if we have transgressed and we deserve justly his wrath and his punishment, and we are willing to receive forgiveness, then we're in a position to be saved. But
So
that's the condition.
so the big deal why sin is a big deal is because it'll either kill you permanently, eternally, or
Mhm.
it kills Christ. So something will die as a result of the violation of oughtness for which you were intended, which is a I mean, yeah, that's a high I fully
Mhm.
recognize the gravity
Yep.
of that sentence. That the flip side of that though is like I don't think if you don't get the gravity of that scenario, then the gospel as quote good news doesn't also have its full force. And so the joy of the goodness of the message of God and the gift of Christ is the opposite of the um heaviness of the consequence of our own actions morally and religiously speaking.
Right. I mean, well, it's not good news if you think you have nothing to be saved from.
Mhm.
That's the
Well,
so
you
in the
remember Jesus saying,
yes.
"If there's any other way, let's do that." I mean, that's a paraphrase, but essentially, if you don't think you need to be saved, you're like, "Yeah, Jesus got this wrong and didn't really understand me."
It's very I mean, the gravity of this could not be more pronounced. And it takes a lot for us to get there as a culture right now. We're in a unique position to where this requires more work right now because it used to be that the gospel was received as too good to be true. This was the Middle Ages where human wretchedness was on vivid display. And the average lifespan was, oh, I don't know, 30. And so many babies, didn't survive birth, and neither did mothers. And there was disease and pestilence everywhere. People recognized human frailty, vulnerability, and wretchedness. But now, in the hyper convenient, hyper connected, hyper distracted 21st century, the gospel is seen as not good enough to be true because we're all happy right here. We've got our soma. Sorry, that's a Brave New World reference. We've got our gummies, whatever you want to say, and we don't need to be saved, and we don't want to feel that. And conviction feels distressing and emotionally, it's burdensome, and
Well,
that's harmful to me.
yeah, can we put in not just respond to the saved from, but say in closing here a word about being saved
Mhm.
for?
Sure.
Because I think a robust soteriology or a robust theology of salvation within our churches is a good thing to think through. That
Mhm.
Jesus wasn't just fundamentally saving people as like I got my passport stamped and now I'm good, but he really was calling them into a way of life that necessitated uh,
Mhm.
death and burial through baptism and then the filling of the Holy Spirit in order that we would arise to walk in the newness of life and have God's Spirit in us and live for God's glory and for our neighbor's good. And there's this whole active, powerful, positive side of salvation that is for God's glory and our neighbor's good, and that we delight in experiencing ourselves. And so it's not, again, this isn't a sin -1, salvation brings us back to zero. This is a
Mhm.
sin -infinity, salvation brings us to positive, um, infinite glory,
Yeah.
and eternal worship of God. And so the extremes of the seesaw are infinite here, but it's not about balancing something out like our sin has to be canceled out. It's more than that. It's the restoration. It's sin is not just for the not just for the negation of the punishment. It's for the restoration of the salvation is for the restoration of the relationship. So if we go back to where I was started in Genesis and then look at the end and now the dwelling place of God is with men, that's the goal. That was the original intent of Adam and Eve and God in the garden. And so God restoring things to the way in which it was intended is the narrative of salvation, not just God canceling our
Mm.
brokenness. So we live in a neutral bubble, but there's really a positive vision to what it is that salvation enables for us. And then our growth and sanctification and the rest is all part of that. But we should think of the opposite of sin as a wonderful opportunity to lean into, not something that like, okay, well, now, my checkbook is balanced and I'm good to go.
I think that's very necessary. Yeah, I mean, this is one beginning, the dark beginning of a full understanding of the redemptive arc of a human life. But if we can't understand or if we can't begin to wrap our heads around the bad news, the good news doesn't make any sense. And so this is why this is a very important place to begin, but it's very important that we don't stay here as well because when we begin to walk with Jesus, we step into newness of life immediately and experience the transformation of we're transformed by the renewals of the renewal of our minds, and it's
Yeah.
an
Which
amazing and
which isn't
glorious
metaphorical
process.
because the Holy Spirit isn't a metaphor.
Right. So Lots more to be said here, of course, as usual, but I think we're at a good point of closure for this particular episode. But yeah, in case you've missed it in the midst of all of this, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.